The egg or the chicken? Which one came first? Common question, you might think. But whichever you think came first, where did it come from? And when was that? Since the beginning of history, the human being has always speculated on the origin of life and everything in the universe. There are millions of different forms of life on Earth, displaying a wide range of differences in terms of their sizes, shapes, and structure. They live in diverse habitats but have underlying similarities which seem to unify them. So how did this happen? Well, there are many different versions of explanations ranging from religious and myths. Currently, the scientific explanation is based on the process of evolution. And evolution is a gradual change of living organisms from simple forms of life to more complex forms over a long period of time. Therefore, evolution is a focal point on scientific investigation into the nature and origin of life. It also offers scientific explanations to the great diversity observed in organisms and in their similarities in structure and function. Now in this video, we're only going to look at the religious view, which is a theory of special creation, and the scientific view, the theory of chemical evolution. Let us start with the special creation theory. Now, for a long time, the answer to the question of how life first began and how the great variety of animals and plants came into existence was provided by religious writings such as the Bible and the Quran. These books narrate that the whole universe and all that it contains was created by the action of a supreme being, God. To create means to bring into existence something out of nothing. We call this intelligent design. This belief is called special creation and holds the following views on the origin and nature of life. First, that life was brought into existence by a supreme being. 2. That life forms were created in a perfect form and have remained unchanged over time. Now, this belief is held by world's major religions. This belief cannot be contradicted by science since it is not scientifically testable. This knowledge is based on faith and cannot be disputed. In fact, in this video, we are not going to go beyond this point, so that next we'll look at chemical evolution. Chemical evolution. Now, this is the scientific view of the origin of life on Earth. The theory of chemical evolution supposes that life probably began through a catalytic effect of lightning or some sort of other catalyst, bringing together elements to form simple molecules such as water, ammonia, and methane. Now, various experiments have been carried out in the laboratory to artificially stimulate conditions that could lead to the initial formation of organic molecules. As a matter of fact, in 1953, S.L. Miller, an American scientist, successfully produced 4 of the 20 known amino acids by basically passing a spark through a mixture of hydrogen, methane, water vapor, and ammonia. The high temperature and pressure conditions used by Miller to synthesize these amino acids were possibly similar to those existing in the universe when life started. From the results of Miller's experiments, it can be theorized that millions of years ago, simple molecules such as hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in the primitive Earth's atmosphere combined in various portions to form different simple compounds such as water and ammonia. further combination of such compounds possibly resulted in the formation of complex self-replicating molecules resembling the present-day DNA, which forms the genetic material of living cells. Successive replications of these molecules and further development probably led to the formation of simple forms of the first living cells. These cells might have resembled the present-day viruses and bacteria. Therefore, the theory of chemical evolution supposes that chemicals combined to form the first living organisms, and this happened between 4 to 3 billion years ago. The theory of chemical evolution of life holds the following views on the origin and nature of life. First, that life came into existence through combinations of chemicals. Secondly, the initial forms of life were simple and have changed over the years to form the present-day complex organisms. This is the principle of organic evolution. So, in totality, the doctrine of chemical evolution is founded on two basic principles. First, the universal common descent, which holds the idea that all living organisms rose from a single species, which follows that all living organisms are related and can be traced to a common ancestry. If so, how then would one explain the vast forms of life in the universe? Good question. Now, the first principle is backed by the second one, the principle of descent with modification. According to this school of thought, as the organisms produced, and specifically through sexual reproduction, random errors occurred in their genetic makeup. This would ultimately result in offsprings which had small differences from their parents. Now, these random errors are what we now know as mutations. So, these mutations introduced diversity in the forms of lives over the many billions of years that the world has existed. Of course, some mutations produced organisms that could not survive and died out. So, over the years, new forms of life arose, and this is why we see all this diversity. It is theorized that the universe came into existence some 15 billion years ago. The solar system seems to have been formed about 6 billion years ago. The planet Earth is supposed to have been formed some 4 billion years ago from the debris of a burnt-out star. Since then, it has undergone cooling and structural changes on its outer crust, which eventually provided the environment for the development of living organisms. Fossil records of the primitive prokaryotes, that is non-nucleated cells, date back to about 1 billion years. These were possibly the first single-celled organisms. There then arose multicellular organisms with increasing complexity in structure and physiology as time passed. The various forms of lower organisms evolved first, followed by the higher forms. Now, this thought is intolerable to the religious groups. Think about it. Isn't it hard to imagine that plants and animals have a common ancestor? Interestingly, this theory is backed by stern scientific evidence and cannot be wished away just like that. However, each of these pieces of evidence has limitations, but let's look at them. The evidence to support this theory is grouped as follows: fossil records, geographical distribution of organisms, comparative embryology, comparative anatomy, and cell biology. Fossil records. Now, fossils are remains of ancestral forms that are accidentally preserved in some naturally occurring materials like sedimentary rocks, plant resins, and so on. The study of fossils is called paleontology. Now, the most common method of fossil formation is petrification, that is, changing of rocks. This is usually possible for hard body parts like bones, teeth, shells, and woody parts of the plant. Fossils are important because they give direct evidence of the type of animals and plants that existed at a certain geological age. These records show that different groups of organisms rose at different times on Earth. For example, the earliest fossils are of Monera, followed by Protoctista, and then the fungi. Plants and animals appeared later. Even among the vertebrates, the oldest fossils are those of fishes, followed by amphibians, and progressively mammals are the latest organisms to appear on Earth. Now, by comparing the fossils of different organisms, it is possible to tell the phylogenetic relationship between organisms. The fossil records have shown a gradual increase in complexity of organisms over time. The older rock strata contain fossils showing simple structures, while younger rock strata contain fossils showing complex structures. Now, there are limitations to the use of fossil records in tracing the evolutionary history of modern-day organisms, and this is due to the fact that 1. There are several missing fossil records, that is, missing links. These gaps in the records have come up because some parts or whole organisms decomposed. Some were scavenged upon, and not all had conditions suitable for fossilization, and only a few fossils have been discovered. Secondly, distortion of parts during sedimentation, which may give wrong impression of the structures. And thirdly, the destruction of fossils by geological activities such as earthquakes, faulting, uplifting, and mass movement. The next piece of evidence is comparative embryology. Now, embryology is the study of formation and development of an embryo. In this study, the embryos of different vertebrate groups have been found to have similar morphological features during their early stages of development. This similarity suggests a common ancestry, and therefore, the closer the resemblance between the embryos in an early stage, the closer the phylogenetic relationship in the organism. This theory is called the recapitulation theory. Another piece of evidence is in the comparative anatomy. Now, when comparing the form and structure of different organisms, we notice that some groups show basic structural similarities. These similarities suggest that the organisms have a common or related ancestry. Where anatomical structures show many differences, such organisms have less evolutionary relationship. Where one basic structural form is modified to give rise to various different forms, the phenomenon is called divergent evolution. These divergent forms originating from a single ancestry form may each become adapted to a different ecological niche in the given habitat. This evolutionary phenomenon is called adaptive radiation. An example of adaptive radiation can be observed in homologous structures. Homologous structures are those that have common embryonic origin but may be modified to perform different functions. Diversity of the vertebrate forelimb is one such example of homologous structures. The form and anatomy of the forelimb differ in various vertebrate groups, while the basic pentadactyl structure is retained, that is the 5-digit structure. The forelimb of a bat is modified to form a wing for flight, while that of a horse is elongated to enhance speed in running. In the whale or in turtle, it is modified to form a swimming flipper. Note that in the above examples, the pentadactyl limb is modified to perform particular locomotory functions. These are flight, running, and swimming. Apart from the homologous and analogous structures, vestigial structures are also used in comparative anatomy. Now, vestigial structures are those that have, in the course of time, ceased to be functional and therefore have become reduced in size or are rudimentary. Examples of such structures include the appendix, which in human has no digestive function, while in herbivores like the rat, it is well developed and functions as the cellulose digesting part of the alimentary canal. The python and the whale have no externally visible hind limbs, but their original presence is evidenced by the existence of a rudimentary pelvic girdle. Flightless birds have reduced wings beneath the body plumage. The vestigial tail is present in humans in the form of a much reduced coccyx. All these examples of vestigial structures seem to point to the fact that they are present and functional originally in their ancestry form. The next piece of evidence is in cell biology. Now, the cells of all higher organisms show basic similarities in their structure and function. Thus, all these cells contain cell membranes and organelles such as ribosomes, Golgi bodies, mitochondria, and the rough ER. They also have some biological and chemical relationships, for example, ATP and DNA. This strongly indicates that all cell types have a common ancestral origin. Apart from the similarities displayed in both plant and animal cells, there are major differences in some structures and chemical substances in their cells. For example, plant cells contain cellulose cell wall, cell sap, chloroplast, starch, and a spherical chemical substance such as chlorophyll. All these features are absent in animal cells. Among the animals, the blood pigments are of universal occurrence. These include hemoglobin, hemocyanin, and chlorochlorine. Hemoglobin is widely distributed in both vertebrates and invertebrates, while hemocyanin occurs in many mollusks and crustaceans. These differences occurring in plants and animal cells indicate that from the common ancestral stock, plants and animals separated and evolved along different lines and a long time ago. So exactly how did this evolution take place? Let's now turn and look at the mechanism of evolution. Several theories have been formulated to explain how evolution may have occurred. Now, among these theories are those proposed by Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck in 1809 and Charles Darwin later in 1859. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck proposed one of the earliest known hypotheses regarding the mechanisms of evolution. Lamarck proposed that when the environment demanded the need or use of a particular structure in an organism, it developed in response to the demand. This therefore led to the natural use or disuse of structures, producing changes in the individual during its lifetime. Lamarck proposed that these changes or structures that were acquired during the lifetime of an individual were then transmitted to their offsprings and subsequent generations, resulting in the emergence of new forms of life or new species. These new forms acquired certain advantages over their ancestral forms in their exploitation of a particular ecological niche. He cited the example of development of the long neck of the giraffe, which developed as a result of ancestral forms towards the higher levels of vegetation in competition with other browsers for food. The longer neck trait so developed was passed on to successive generations, giving them advantage over the shorter necked forms. Eventually, a new longer necked species, the present-day giraffe, was formed. Another example to illustrate Lamarck's theory is the appearance of flightless birds such as the ostrich, emu, and kiwi. Their reduced and functionless wings probably resulted from their disuse in an environment that didn't require flying. Now, sounds sensible, but wait. Lamarck's explanation on the role of environment in directing phenotypic changes in an individual is valid. For example, a bodybuilder will have huge muscles due to continuous use of the muscles. However, it is his explanation that acquired characteristics are inherited that makes his theory unacceptable. Phenotypically acquired characteristics which do not affect the genotype of an individual cannot be inherited. Then came the second argument, Darwin's theory of natural selection. Now, in his book, The Origin of Species in 1959, Charles Darwin proposed an explanation for the mechanism of evolution in contrast to Lamarck's theory. Darwin put forward his explanation based on the concept he called natural selection. The main features of his theory include the following. It is observed that variations occur within members of a population. These variations arise by chance and from within the individual. Through sexual reproduction, these characteristics are transmitted to successive offspring. Some of the variations confer an advantage to the individuals, while others are disadvantageous. Secondly, the number of offspring far outnumber the parental generations, but only a few survive to adulthood and are able to reproduce. This is due to environmental pressures such as predation, diseases, and competition for food, breeding sites, and mates. Therefore, then, numbers of populations remain relatively constant. This means that members of a population are constantly competing with each other in an effort to survive, what is referred to as struggle for existence. 3. In the struggle for existence, individuals with advantageous variations are well adapted to the environment. Since they are suited to the environment they are selected for, hence survive and reproduce. Those that are poorly adapted perish and do not transmit their characteristics, and this he called survival of the fittest. Now, the terms struggle for existence and survival of the fittest are sometimes misunderstood. Rather than implying actual physical struggle and strength, they are used to mean respectively environmental pressures on the population and any advantageous variation an individual possesses to make it survive. For example, a cryptically colored individual does not struggle to escape predators, but its color camouflages it, thus it escapes predation. According to Darwin, natural selection is a chance occurrence. Neither the environment nor the individual itself controls the direction of change. So it is just by chance that certain individuals or species are suited to a particular environment or environmental changes. Finally, those individuals that are selected for reproduction thus transmit the variation to their offspring. The gradual accumulation of small variations from generation to generation over a long period of time leads to emergence of new forms of species. The variations that Darwin regarded as the raw materials for the process of evolution have now been traced to changes that occur at the level of the gene or the chromosome. These changes are called mutations, and mutations occur randomly. Organisms with beneficial mutations are able to pass them on to their offspring during reproduction. Sexual reproduction is particularly significant since meiosis leads to new recombination while fertilization spreads the genes widely in the population. Transmission of such mutations through many generations could lead to the emergence of new species. So let us look clearly at what natural selection is. Natural selection is one of the key concepts contained within the theory of evolution. To understand exactly what natural selection is and why it's so important, let us first take a quick look at the two other evolutionary concepts, descent with modification and the other idea of common descent. Descent with modification is the observable fact that when parents have children, those children often look and behave slightly different from the parents and slightly different from each other. They descend from their parents with modifications. The differences found in the offsprings are partially due to random genetic mutations. Common descent is the idea that all living things on earth are related. They descended from a common ancestor. Through the gradual process of descent with modification over many generations, a single original species is thought to have given rise to all the life we see today. The common descent of all life on earth is not one directly observable fact. We have no way of going back in time to watch it happen. Instead, common descent is a conclusion based on a massive collection of facts. Facts found independently in the study of fossils, genetics, comparative anatomy, mathematics, biochemistry, and species distribution. Because the evidence of common descent is overwhelming, the concept has been present since ancient times. In the past, however, it was rejected by many philosophers and scientists for one major reason. You cannot get order and complexity from random chaos alone. The bodies and behavior of living things are extremely complex and orderly. Descent with modification simply produces random variations. All through history, no one can explain how complex life arose from the simple life through random variation until Charles Darwin discovered natural selection. Charles Darwin, who lived between 1809 and 1882, was a naturalist, or someone who studies nature. During his studies, Darwin became interested in the idea of common descent. He noticed that islands contain species of plants and animals unique to those islands. They can't be found anyplace else on Earth, but they often look and behave surprisingly similar to creatures found on nearby continents. Tortoises in the Galapagos Islands can be distinguished from those of Africa. Meanwhile, with the exception of size, they are almost identical to a species found nearby in South America. Darwin believed that these similarities could be best explained through common descent. Long ago, a tortoise from the mainland may have drifted to the island, possibly on a raft of storm debris, and once it was there, laid her eggs. Random changes caused by descent with modifications over thousands of years eventually transformed the island creatures and the mainland creatures so much that they could no longer be considered the same species. This idea made good sense to Darwin, except for one thing. The island creatures he found were not just randomly different from their mainland cousins. They were specially adapted for island life. Galapagos is a collection of 18 main islands, many of which are home to tortoises. The large islands have lots of grass and vegetation. Tortoises here grow extra heavy and have dome-like shells. Some of the smaller islands have little grass, forcing the tortoise to feed on island's cactus. The best cactus parts grow on top of these plants. Fortunately, tortoises from these islands are equipped with expanded front legs and saddle-like shells, allowing them to stretch their necks extra long to reach their food. It is almost as if these island creatures have been perfectly suited to survive in a unique environment. How did this adaptation take place? Random descent with modification alone can never do such a thing. Darwin drew upon his knowledge of selective breeding to answer this question. For thousands of years, farmers have been taking wild plants and animals and through the process of selective breeding have transformed the original wild forms into new domestic forms much better suited for human use and consumption. The process is slow but simple. If a single plant produces 100 seeds, most will grow to be nearly identical to the parent. A few, however, will be slightly different. Some variations will be undesirable, smaller size, bitter taste, vulnerability to diseases, and so on. Other variations will be highly valued, thicker sweet leaves, for example. If a farmer only allows the best plants to reproduce and create seeds for the next generation, small positive changes would add up over multiple generations, eventually producing a dramatically superior vegetable. You might be surprised to know that the broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbages are all just different breeds of a single type of weed commonly found along the shores of the English Channel. The evolution of this original plant into all the varieties we see today was carefully guided by different farmers around the world who simply selected for different traits. It's important to note that the farmer doesn't create anything. Random descent with modification creates new traits. The farmer simply chooses which of these new creations are allowed to reproduce and which ones are not. Darwin proposed that nature itself is also capable of selection. It may not have an intelligent brain like a farmer, but nature is an extremely cruel place to live. There are germs which can and do kill. Animals that can eat can die of heat exhaustion or exposure to cold. When parents produce a variety of offspring, nature, simply by being difficult to survive in, decides which of these variations gets to live and reproduce and which ones do not. Over multiple generations, creatures become more and more fit to survive in their specific environment. Darwin called this process natural selection. Since Darwin proposed this idea in the mid-1800s, natural selection has been studied and witnessed numerous times in nature and in the science lab. What started as a mere idea is now officially an observable fact. This discovery has greatly expanded our understanding of the natural world and led to countless breakthroughs and has finally allowed scientists to seriously consider the idea of common descent. So in summary, natural selection is the process by which random evolutionary changes are selected for by nature in a consistent, orderly, non-random way. Through the process of descent with modification, new traits are produced. Nature then carefully chooses which of these traits to keep. Positive changes add up to a multiple generation. Negative traits are quickly discarded. Through this simple, ongoing process, nature, even though it doesn't have a thinking mind, is capable of producing incredibly complex and beautiful creations. Now, that is all about life and its origin and the theories put forward to explain the same. So many religious groups can tolerate the notion that both the earth and the universe are billions of years old, or even the idea that God created different organisms during different times and in different places throughout the course of the Earth's history, as the geological column would seem to suggest. But the idea of evolution between species is usually considered incompatible with religious orthodoxy. Now, whichever school of thought you choose to subscribe to, the belief in the presence or absence of a supreme being, that is God, in my opinion, should not be used to cancel out moral accountability. My name is Lawrence.
Without many of these discoveries and inventions, few of us would be alive today. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 greatest medical breakthroughs in history. Number 7. Painkillers. In the 1800s, two of the most important analgesics were introduced to the world, morphine and aspirin. Since then, the pain-killing properties of the naturally occurring chemical compound known as morphine have lessened the suffering of an immeasurable number of human beings and have led to the development of many other analgesics. Meanwhile, German chemist Felix Hoffmann's synthesis of acetylsalicylic acid into aspirin for medical purposes has turned the drug into one of the planet's most popular medications for pain relief.